In the quiet corners of history, far from the thunder of cannons and the cheers of marching armies, a slight man with fragile health and an enormous mind reshaped the modern world. He did not lead troops across frozen rivers. He did not dominate rooms with towering presence. Instead, James Madison sat, listened, argued softly, and designed the invisible machinery of a nation. 18th century America was loud with revolution. Men like George Washington became symbols carved in marble, embodiments of unity and command. But symbols alone cannot govern a republic. Beneath the banners and victories, someone had to answer a harder question. How do you prevent power from destroying the very liberty it claims to protect? Madison obsessed over that question. In cramped rooms, by candlelight, he studied the failures of ancient republics and modern confederations. He feared not kings alone, but factions, ambition, and human nature itself. While others imagined freedom as a triumph, Madison saw it as a delicate system, one that could collapse without careful design. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he spoke often, but never theatrically. He took meticulous notes, proposed bold frameworks, and endured compromise after compromise. What emerged was not merely a document, but a living structure. Checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism. Ideas so durable that they would outlive wars, presidents, and centuries of conflict. Washington would become the face of the Republic. Madison became its nervous system. Tonight, as we slow our minds and step back into the past, we tell the story of the man who believed that liberty survives not through force, but through design. This is the story of James Madison, the architect of the American Constitution and the quiet guardian of a fragile union. If you enjoy thoughtful, slow-burn histories like this one, take a moment to subscribe and join us. And as we begin, let us know in the comments, can ideas truly shape the world more lastingly than power? Let the story begin. Chapter 1. From Virginia Soil, Birth of a Mind. James Madison was born on March 16, 1751, into the rolling countryside of Virginia's Piedmont region at a plantation called Montpelier. The land was generous, the seasons predictable, and the rhythms of plantation life deeply rooted in tradition. From the outside, it was an unlikely birthplace for a revolutionary mind. Yet within this quiet landscape, far from imperial capitals and great universities, a thinker was slowly taking shape. Madison was a small and often sickly child, prone to bouts of illness that kept him indoors while others worked the fields. These confinements, rather than weakening him, sharpened his inner life. Books became his companions. Thought became his refuge. While Virginia society prized land, lineage, and physical command, young James developed an early respect for something less visible but more powerful: the disciplined use of reason. His family recognized his intellectual promise and invested in his education. After early schooling in Virginia, Madison was sent north to the College of New Jersey, what we now know as Princeton University. It was a bold choice. Most sons of Virginia planters stayed within the colonial South, but Madison entered a more radical intellectual environment, shaped by Enlightenment ideas and Presbyterian rigor. At Princeton, Madison studied with extraordinary intensity. He compressed years of coursework into a short span, often sacrificing sleep to satisfy his hunger for knowledge. Philosophy, history, theology, and political theory filled his days and nights. He read John Locke on natural rights, Montesquieu on the separation of powers, and ancient histories that chronicled the rise and fall of republics. These were not abstract exercises. Madison read with urgency, as if sensing that the world he lived in was about to change, and that it would need careful thinkers more than heroic warriors. Even in his youth, Madison worried about power. He observed how religious intolerance still lingered in colonial Virginia, and how authority, once granted, was rarely surrendered willingly. These early concerns planted the seeds of ideas that would later define his life. Liberty must be protected not only from tyrants, but from majorities, passions, and unchecked ambition. When Madison returned to Montpelier after Princeton, he did not come back as a passive heir. He returned as a young man restless with questions. The colonies were drifting toward conflict with Britain, and Madison was already thinking beyond independence itself. Winning freedom, he believed, would be only the beginning. The far greater challenge would be preserving it. In the quiet rooms of his childhood home, surrounded by Virginia's soil and Enlightenment books, James Madison began the lifelong work that would define him, not as a man of action, but as a man of structure, a guardian of ideas, a builder of systems, and in time, the architect of a nation's mind. Chapter 2: Enlightenment in the Colonies. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were no longer merely settlements on the edge of an empire. They had become laboratories of ideas. Taverns, churches, and private libraries buzzed with arguments about liberty, authority, and the rights of man. Pamphlets crossed the Atlantic as frequently as ships, carrying the thoughts of European philosophers into the hands of colonial readers who were beginning to question the foundations of power itself. James Madison absorbed this world with quiet intensity. Unlike fiery orators who thrilled crowds, Madison preferred solitude and study. At Montpelier, he continued the disciplined habits formed at Princeton, reading deeply and systematically. John Locke's arguments for natural rights and government by consent left a lasting imprint on his thinking. From Locke, Madison learned that political authority was not divine, but conditional, granted by the people and revocable when abused. Equally influential was Montesquieu, whose Spirit of the Laws offered a sobering lesson from history. Liberty collapses when power concentrates. Montesquieu's insistence on separating legislative, executive, and judicial authority resonated strongly with Madison. It aligned with his growing fear that tyranny could arise not only from kings, but from popular majorities driven by passion rather than reason. Yet Madison's intellectual awakening was not without tension. He was, after all, a son of Virginia's planter elite, raised within a hierarchical society built on tradition, deference, and inherited power. Enlightenment ideas challenged these assumptions. They asked uncomfortable questions about religious conformity, political privilege, and the moral legitimacy of long-standing institutions. Madison felt this conflict deeply. He admired order and stability, yet recognized that unexamined tradition could become a prison. He valued harmony, yet understood that silence in the face of injustice was a form of complicity. Nowhere was this more evident than in his growing concern over religious freedom. In Virginia, dissenting Protestants were still fined or imprisoned for worship outside the established church. Madison found this intolerable, not only morally, but philosophically. A government that could dictate belief, he reasoned, could dictate anything. As tensions with Britain escalated, Madison watched with cautious sympathy. He supported resistance to imperial overreach, but he was wary of revolutionary excess. Emotion, he believed, could be as dangerous as oppression. Liberty required not only courage, but restraint, structures capable of channeling human ambition rather than surrendering to it. By the time open conflict loomed on the horizon, Madison had already traveled far in his mind. He was not intoxicated by rebellion, nor comforted by tradition. He stood in the uneasy space between the two, convinced that the coming break from Britain would demand more than independence. It would demand a new understanding of power itself. In the candle-lit rooms of colonial Virginia, amid books borrowed from Europe and ideas reshaped for a new world, James Madison was preparing for a task he did not yet fully see, but one history was quietly placing in his hands. Chapter 3: Revolution and Resolve. When revolution finally arrived, it did not come to James Madison with the thunder of muskets or the romance of the battlefield. It arrived instead as a moral and intellectual reckoning. The young colonies were breaking from Britain, but Madison already understood that independence alone would not guarantee liberty. Freedom, once claimed, would have to be governed, and that responsibility weighed heavily on him. In 1776, as Virginia moved to sever its ties with the Crown, Madison was elected to the Virginia Convention. He was only 25 years old, slight in build and reserved in speech, easily overlooked among louder men with sharper tempers. Yet beneath his quiet demeanor was a mind sharpened by years of study and reflection. Madison listened carefully, spoke sparingly, and intervened when ideas, not applause, were at stake. One of his earliest and most deeply felt battles was over religious liberty. The old establishment of the Anglican Church still cast a long shadow over Virginia law, even as revolutionary rhetoric proclaimed freedom and equality. Madison saw the contradiction clearly. In letters and debates, he argued that true liberty could not coexist with state-imposed belief. His insistence helped strengthen the language that would become Virginia's Declaration of Rights, laying early groundwork for the principle of freedom of conscience. Service in the Virginia legislature exposed Madison to the difficult reality of self-government. Revolutionary enthusiasm did not erase human flaws. Factions formed quickly. Personal rivalries interfered with public good. Laws were passed impulsively, then repealed just as hastily. Madison observed all of this with growing concern. The people, he realized, were not angels. Neither were their representatives. This realization created an emotional tension within him. Madison loved his community, his state, and the cause of independence. Yet he was increasingly convinced that good intentions were not enough. Loyalty to tradition and local control, while comforting, could also enable injustice and instability. Reform was necessary, but reform, he believed, must be deliberate, structured, and restrained. Unlike many revolutionaries, Madison was not seduced by the language of unlimited popular power. He feared that unchecked majorities could be as tyrannical as kings. The challenge, as he saw it, was not how to unleash the will of the people, but how to refine and stabilize it. This belief set him apart, even from allies who shared his commitment to independence. As the war dragged on and the new states struggled to govern themselves, Madison's resolve hardened. The revolution had opened the door to self-rule, but it had also revealed its dangers. In committee rooms and legislative chambers, he began to sense a deeper mission forming, one that reached beyond Virginia and beyond the war itself. James Madison was coming of age not as a soldier or a firebrand, but as a student of power under pressure. The revolution had given him purpose. Experience was giving him clarity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was preparing himself for a far greater task, designing a system strong enough to protect liberty from both tyranny and chaos. Chapter 4. A Fragile Confederation. When the War for Independence drew toward its uncertain conclusion, the young United States found itself bound together by a document born more of fear than confidence. The Articles of Confederation reflected a nation wary of centralized power, determined never to recreate the tyranny it had just escaped. Authority rested almost entirely with the individual states. The national government, by design, was weak, unable to tax, unable to regulate trade, and dependent on voluntary cooperation for its survival. James Madison entered this new era with cautious hope and growing unease. As a delegate to the Continental Congress in the early 1780s, he witnessed firsthand how idealism collided with reality. Congress could recommend, but not compel. It could promise, but not deliver. Soldiers went unpaid. Foreign creditors doubted American reliability. Rivalries between states threatened the fragile unity forged in war. Madison watched these failures accumulate with deep concern. What others dismissed as temporary inconveniences, he recognized as structural flaws. The problem, in his view, was not the character of the leaders, but the design of the system itself. A government that could not act decisively, he feared, would eventually lose the respect of both its citizens and the wider world. This period sharpened Madison's thinking more than any book ever had. He began to study confederacies across history, ancient leagues, modern alliances, and recent European examples, searching for patterns of collapse. Again and again, he found the same lesson. When collective action depends solely on goodwill, it rarely endures. Power, if too dispersed, becomes paralysis. Yet Madison's anxiety was not merely intellectual. The revolution had promised a new kind of future, one built on self-government and liberty. To see that promise threatened by dysfunction was deeply personal. He worried that the American experiment might fail not through conquest, but through exhaustion, fractured by debt, discord, and mistrust. In letters to friends and fellow statesmen, Madison's tone grew increasingly urgent. He spoke of the need for energy in government, not as a pathway to tyranny, but as a safeguard against disintegration. Liberty, he believed, required a structure strong enough to sustain it. Without that structure, freedom itself would become fragile. The Articles of Confederation, Madison concluded, were a necessary beginning, but only a beginning. They had preserved independence, but they could not preserve a nation. Reform, once a distant thought, now felt unavoidable. As the 1780s progressed, economic turmoil and political unrest deepened Madison's sense of foreboding. Events like interstate trade disputes and domestic uprisings hinted at a darker possibility, that the United States might dissolve into a collection of quarrelsome republics, remembered only as a noble failure. In the quiet moments between congressional sessions, Madison began sketching ideas, not yet a constitution, but the outlines of a solution. The task ahead was daunting. To strengthen the national government without destroying liberty seemed almost impossible. And yet, James Madison believed that history had placed this burden on his generation. The question was no longer whether change was necessary, but whether they would act in time to save the Republic from its own weaknesses. Chapter 5. Philadelphia Beckons. In the spring of 1787, James Madison arrived in Philadelphia with a sense of urgency that few around him fully understood. The city, still marked by the memories of revolution, was preparing to host a gathering unlike any before it. Officially, the delegates were convening to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, many suspected that something far more radical was about to unfold. Madison came prepared. Months before the first delegate took his seat, he'd immersed himself in the study of past republics and confederacies. Ancient Greece, the Roman Republic, medieval leagues, and modern European states filled his notebooks. From these examples, he distilled a sobering conclusion. History was unkind to loose alliances. Without a stronger national framework, the United States would fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. When Madison entered the Pennsylvania State House, he was only 36 years old, one of the youngest men in the room. Around him sat figures of immense reputation. George Washington, whose presence alone commanded silence, Benjamin Franklin, aging but revered, and seasoned politicians from every state. Madison, slight and soft-spoken, seemed almost invisible by comparison. Yet few delegates had arrived with such clarity of purpose. The atmosphere inside the hall was tense, heavy with expectation. Windows were shut against prying ears. Guards stood watch. Summer heat pressed in as debates stretched for hours. What was being attempted here was nothing less than the reinvention of government itself. Madison felt the weight of that responsibility acutely. Failure would not merely embarrass the delegates, it could doom the fragile republic. From the opening days, Madison listened carefully, gauging temperaments and alliances. He understood that logic alone would not prevail. Pride, fear, and regional interest shaped every argument. Large states worried about being constrained by smaller ones. Small states feared domination. Beneath every speech lay an unspoken question. Who would hold power in the new America? Madison's answer was neither simple nor comforting. Power, he believed, must be divided, filtered, and restrained. No single branch, faction, or region could be trusted with unchecked authority. This belief guided his most ambitious contribution to the convention, a comprehensive plan that proposed a new national government, grounded in the people, yet insulated from their most volatile impulses. As discussions intensified, Madison felt both hope and anxiety. Each agreement hinted at possibility. Each deadlock threatened collapse. Compromise was unavoidable, but every compromise risked weakening the system he envisioned. Still, he persisted, trusting that imperfect structure was better than elegant failure. At night, Madison recorded the day's debates in meticulous detail, unaware that his notes would one day become the most complete record of the convention.
For him, they were an act of duty, an attempt to preserve the reasoning behind decisions that would shape generations. Philadelphia in 1787 was not merely a meeting place. It was a crucible. And within its closed doors, James Madison carried the quiet but immense burden of helping to design a government that could survive human nature itself. Chapter 6. Blueprint for a Republic. As the Constitutional Convention settled into its rhythm, James Madison moved from observer to architect. The moment he had been preparing for had arrived. What he carried into the Pennsylvania State House was not a speech meant to stir hearts, but a design meant to discipline power itself. It would come to be known as the Virginia Plan, a blueprint for a republic unlike any the world had seen. The plan struck at the heart of the convention's purpose. Madison proposed abandoning the loose framework of the Articles of Confederation altogether and replacing it with a truly national government. Representation would be based on population, not state equality. The legislature would be divided into two chambers. The executive and judiciary would be independent, each checking the others. Authority would flow not from states, but directly from the people. It was a bold vision and immediately controversial. For delegates from smaller states, the plan felt like a threat to their political survival. Equal representation had been their shield against domination. To surrender it now seemed reckless, even dangerous. Voices rose, tempers flared, the room filled with arguments about fairness, sovereignty, and the meaning of union. Madison did not raise his voice to match theirs. He rarely did. Instead, he returned again and again to first principles. History, he reminded them, offered few examples of successful confederacies. Popular governments failed not because they lacked virtue, but because they lacked structure. Factions formed naturally. Ambition was inevitable. A well-designed system did not deny these truths, it managed them. Debate after debate tested Madison's resolve. Compromises chipped away at the clean symmetry of his design. Some provisions were softened, others were postponed. Each concession carried an emotional cost. Madison understood that perfection was impossible, yet he feared that too much compromise would leave the nation vulnerable once again. The intellectual rigor of the convention was relentless. Delegates argued over the nature of representation, the scope of executive power, and the balance between national and state authority. Madison thrived in this environment. His strength was not charisma, but clarity. He listened closely, responded precisely, and adjusted carefully, never abandoning the core idea that liberty depended on durable institutions. In a room dominated by towering personalities, Madison's persistence was quiet but unyielding. While others sought immediate advantage, he thought in decades and centuries. While others spoke to be remembered, he spoke to be correct. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the depth of his preparation. Few had come so ready to govern the future. Behind the scenes, Madison continued to record everything: arguments, votes, reversals. His notes captured not only decisions, but the fragile reasoning behind them. They revealed a convention struggling not merely to write laws, but to understand human nature. By the time debate moved beyond the Virginia Plan itself, its influence was unmistakable. Though altered, contested, and reshaped, its core ideas had taken root. The convention was no longer repairing a confederation. It was constructing a republic. For James Madison, this was both triumph and trial. The blueprint was alive, but unfinished. And the greatest test still lay ahead: whether this carefully balanced system could survive the passions, ambitions, and imperfections of the people it was designed to serve. Chapter 7. Checks, Balances, and Compromise. As the summer of 1787 deepened, the promise of the Constitutional Convention gave way to its most perilous phase. The delegates were no longer debating ideas in the abstract. They were deciding who would hold power and how much of it. On these questions, unity proved fragile. At the center of the conflict stood representation. Large states favored population-based influence, believing it reflected democratic fairness. Smaller states feared erasure, convinced that without equal footing, their interests would be swallowed by more populous neighbors. The convention teetered on the edge of collapse as tempers hardened and alliances fractured. For James Madison, this was a moment of profound strain. He believed deeply that representation should be tied to the people themselves.
not the artificial equality of states. Equal voting power for unequal populations, he argued, violated the very principle of republican government. Yet he could not ignore the political reality before him. Without compromise, there would be no constitution at all. The solution that emerged, the Great Compromise, split the difference. One chamber of Congress would represent the people by population. The other would preserve state equality. It was not Madison's preferred outcome. In private, he worried that the Senate structure might entrench local interests and slow national action. Still, he accepted the bargain, recognizing that stability sometimes demands sacrifice. These struggles extended beyond representation. How powerful should the executive be? How independent the judiciary? How far should federal authority reach into state affairs? Each question reopened old fears of tyranny. Delegates who had fought a king were reluctant to empower any single office too greatly. Madison pressed for balance rather than dominance. Power, he argued, should be divided not to weaken government, but to prevent its abuse. Legislative ambition would check executive overreach. Judicial review would restrain both. The system would not rely on virtue alone, but on self-interest, carefully arranged against itself. Emotionally, these weeks tested Madison's resolve. He had arrived with confidence shaped by study and preparation. Now he faced the limits of theory in the face of human negotiation. Compromise blurred the clean lines of his vision. Doubt crept in. Would this system be strong enough? Or would concession after concession recreate the very weaknesses they sought to escape? Yet Madison did not withdraw. Instead, his thinking matured. He came to see compromise not as failure, but as a political art, a way to bind diverse interests into a workable whole. Purity, he learned, could be the enemy of endurance. As debates dragged on in the oppressive heat, Madison continued to write, refine, and persuade. He spoke with patience rather than force, trusting that reason would slowly outlast passion. His influence was rarely dramatic, but it was constant. By the time the convention reached its later stages, a new architecture of government was emerging, complex, imperfect, and deliberately constrained. It bore the marks of many hands, but its underlying logic remained Madison's. Liberty protected by structure, ambition restrained by ambition. In these moments of doubt and resolve, James Madison discovered a deeper truth. The survival of a republic does not depend on flawless design, but on the willingness of its builders to compromise without surrendering principle. And in that balance, the Constitution took its final shape. Chapter 8. Federalist Fire. The Constitution, though completed in Philadelphia, was far from secure. Its fate now rested not in a sealed chamber, but in the hands of the people and their state-ratifying conventions. Across the country, skepticism spread quickly. Many feared that the new framework granted too much power to a distant national government. Others warned that hard-won liberties might quietly slip away behind elegant words. James Madison understood the danger immediately. A constitution unread was a constitution misunderstood. If its principles were left to rumor and suspicion, the entire project could unravel. In New York, opposition was fierce. It was there, amid one of the most divided political climates in the young republic, that Madison joined forces with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. Together, they launched an unprecedented campaign of persuasion, a series of essays published under the shared pseudonym Publius, known today as the Federalist Papers. The task was exhausting. Hamilton wrote with speed and force, Jay with clarity and restraint. Madison brought something different, a disciplined calm, a willingness to dissect complex ideas and render them accessible without diluting their meaning. Night after night, he wrote by candlelight, shaping arguments not to inflame emotion, but to steady it. In these essays, Madison confronted the deepest fears of Republican government. Could a large republic survive? Would factions tear it apart? His answer, most famously articulated in Federalist No. 10, turned conventional wisdom on its head. Rather than viewing diversity and scale as dangers, Madison argued they could be safeguards. A large republic, he reasoned, would make it harder for any single faction to dominate. Pluralism, if properly structured, could protect liberty rather than threaten it. The emotional intensity of this advocacy ran deep. Madison was no longer designing a system in theory, he was defending it in public, knowing that rejection could undo years of work. Every essay felt like a fragile bridge between fear and trust. He chose words carefully, aware that clarity itself was a form of responsibility. Unlike speeches delivered to cheering crowds, these writings demanded patience from their readers. Madison explained checks and balances, separation of powers, and federalism with deliberate precision. He believed that a republic could not survive on slogans alone. Citizens had to understand the logic of their government if they were to sustain it. As essays circulated from newspaper to newspaper, the tone of the debate slowly shifted. Skeptics did not disappear, but confusion began to give way to comprehension. The Constitution was no longer a mysterious instrument. It was a system that could be examined, questioned, and defended. For Madison, this period was both draining and affirming. He had always trusted ideas more than force. Now, ideas were carrying the weight of the nation's future.
When ratification finally came, it was not universal nor enthusiastic everywhere, but it was enough. The Constitution had survived its trial by argument. In the quiet aftermath, Madison knew one thing with certainty. The Republic had been won, not only with muskets and treaties, but with carefully chosen words, written to cool the passions of the moment and preserve liberty for generations yet unborn. Chapter 9. Bill of Rights. Guarding Liberty. With the Constitution ratified and the new government preparing to take its first steps, James Madison faced a quiet but profound dilemma. The framework he had helped design was strong, deliberately so. Yet many Americans remained uneasy. They feared that power, once consolidated, would grow ambitious. Without explicit protections, they worried that liberty might slowly erode, not by force, but by neglect. Madison had once shared some of these doubts himself. During the Constitutional Convention, he questioned whether listing rights might prove dangerous. What if future governments claimed that unlisted rights did not exist? What if written guarantees created a false sense of security? Structure, he believed, was the first defense of freedom. A properly balanced system would make tyranny difficult, regardless of parchment promises. But experience tempered theory. The ratification debates revealed how deeply Americans valued explicit assurances. Opposition to the Constitution often centered on this absence. Madison listened, he reflected, and in doing so, he evolved. Elected to the First Congress in 1789, Madison entered the House of Representatives determined to reconcile principle with necessity. He no longer saw amendments as a concession to fear, but as a means of strengthening public trust. Liberty, he came to understand, was not protected by structure alone. It also required affirmation, clear signals of restraint written into law. Drafting the amendments was an intensely personal task. Madison sifted through proposals from the states, carefully refining language to protect essential freedoms without undermining the Constitution's coherence. Freedom of religion, speech, and the press. The right to bear arms. Protections against arbitrary arrest and punishment. These were not abstract ideals to him. They were safeguards against the very abuses history had taught him to fear. Emotionally, this process carried weight. Madison was amending a document he deeply respected, one he had helped bring into existence. To change it so soon felt risky, yet failing to act felt worse. A republic, he believed, must be strong enough to adapt without unraveling. The amendments passed Congress with less resistance than many expected. By 1791, 10 of them were ratified by the states. Together, they became known as the Bill of Rights. For Madison, the moment was quietly profound. He did not celebrate with speeches or ceremony. Instead, he watched as the Constitution gained a new layer, not of power, but of restraint. The government he had helped design now carried explicit limits on its reach, affirming that liberty was not merely implied, but promised. In later years, Madison would be remembered as the father of the Constitution, but in securing the Bill of Rights, he became something more nuanced, a guardian willing to revise his own thinking in service of a larger truth. Liberty, he had learned, is never fully secured by design alone. It must be named, protected, and renewed, generation after generation. Chapter 10. Secretary of State in Tumultuous Times. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, James Madison stepped into the role of Secretary of State at a moment when the young republic faced dangers far beyond its borders. Europe was engulfed in near constant war. Britain and Napoleonic France struggled for dominance, and their conflict spilled across oceans, drawing neutral nations into its orbit whether they wished to be involved or not. For Madison, this was a different kind of test. No longer working primarily in theory or legislative design, he now had to apply constitutional principles to the unforgiving realities of international power. The United States was militarily weak, economically vulnerable, and deeply divided at home. Every decision carried risk. Madison approached diplomacy with the same disciplined restraint that had defined his earlier work. He believed that American independence depended on avoiding entanglement in Europe's endless wars. Neutrality, however, was easier to declare than to enforce. British naval power dominated the seas, and American merchant ships became frequent targets. Sailors were seized under the practice of impressment, claimed as British subjects and forced into service. Each incident tested Madison's patience and resolve. Public anger rose. Calls for retaliation grew louder. Yet Madison resisted rash action. War, he knew, could endanger the Republic's fragile institutions just as surely as foreign insult. His task was to defend American sovereignty without provoking catastrophe. Under Jefferson's direction, Madison helped craft policies aimed at economic pressure rather than military confrontation. The Louisiana Purchase, though primarily Jefferson's initiative, required careful diplomatic execution, an achievement that doubled the nation's size and secured its future without bloodshed. Later, the Embargo Act sought to use American trade as leverage, cutting off commerce with warring European powers in hopes of forcing respect for neutrality. The embargo, however, proved deeply unpopular and economically painful. Madison felt the strain acutely. As Secretary of State,
He bore responsibility for policies that aligned with principle but faltered in practice. It was a sobering lesson. Even the most carefully reasoned strategies could produce unintended consequences. Throughout these years, Madison remained calm under pressure, rarely yielding to emotion. Yet beneath his measured exterior lay growing concern. Diplomatic restraint was buying time, but how much? Could patience preserve peace indefinitely in a world ruled by empires? By the end of Jefferson's presidency, Madison had become a seasoned statesman, tempered by success and failure alike. He had learned that governing was not merely about preserving ideals, but about navigating imperfect choices in an imperfect world. The Republic had survived these turbulent years, but the storms gathering on the horizon would soon demand even more from James Madison, not as an advisor, but as the nation's chief executive. Chapter 11. The War of 1812 and the Burning of Washington. When James Madison became president in 1809, he inherited a nation still struggling to defend its sovereignty without surrendering its principles. Years of diplomatic pressure had failed to halt British impressment of American sailors or interference with American trade. Public patience was wearing thin. In Congress, a new generation of leaders demanded action. War, once the last resort, began to feel inevitable. In June of 1812, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war against Britain. It was a decision that weighed heavily on him. He was not a man drawn to conflict. He understood, better than most, the risks war posed to a republic still testing its own strength. Yet, inaction, he believed, threatened to reduce American independence to a hollow promise. The war that followed was uneven and often humiliating. American forces were poorly prepared. Early campaigns faltered. New England states resisted the conflict, deepening internal divisions. For Madison, the strain was constant. Every defeat raised doubts, not only about military competence, but about the wisdom of the war itself. The crisis reached its darkest moment in August of 1814. British troops marched into Washington, D.C., meeting little resistance. Public buildings were set ablaze. The Capitol, the President's House, the symbols of American government reduced to smoking ruins. Madison, forced to flee the city, watched from a distance as the physical embodiment of the Republic burned. The emotional weight of that moment was immense. Critics declared the war a failure. Enemies abroad and skeptics at home questioned whether the American experiment could survive such humiliation. For a man who had devoted his life to building institutions, the destruction of the Capitol struck at something deeply personal. Yet Madison did not collapse under the disaster. His resilience was quiet, almost stubborn. He returned to the Capitol as soon as it was safe, determined to continue governing amid the ashes. Reconstruction began even before the war ended, a symbolic refusal to surrender the nation's future to despair. Gradually, the tide turned. American victories on the Great Lakes and at key battles restored confidence. The defense of Baltimore, immortalized in song, reignited national pride. When peace was finally secured with the Treaty of Ghent, the war ended largely where it had begun, but the Republic emerged changed. Though the conflict resolved few of the original grievances on paper, it confirmed something more important. The United States had endured. Its government had not collapsed. Its constitution had survived the strain of war. For Madison, this was vindication of a different kind. He had never promised that the system he designed would prevent suffering or failure. He believed only that it could endure them. In the embers of a burned Capitol, James Madison saw proof of his life's work, not in triumph, but in survival. And sometimes, for a republic, survival is victory enough.
Chapter 12. The Father of the Constitution, at Home. When James Madison left the presidency in 1817, he did not seek another stage. He returned instead to Montpelier, the Virginia estate where his life had begun, carrying with him the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent decades holding a fragile republic together. The nation moved on, but Madison turned inward, toward memory, reflection, and the long shadow of legacy. At home, life unfolded more slowly. Madison oversaw the plantation, corresponded with old friends, and welcomed visitors who came not for spectacle, but for counsel. Though widely celebrated as the Father of the Constitution, he wore the title lightly. Praise, he believed, belonged not to individuals, but to the system itself. Much of his time was devoted to writing. Madison organized his notes from the Constitutional Convention, carefully preserved for decades, adding context and reflection. He understood their historical value and guarded them closely, instructing that they not be published until all the principal figures of the convention had passed. History, he felt, deserved accuracy, unclouded by personal rivalry. These years were not without struggle. Madison was aging, his health declining. Financial pressures mounted as plantation economics shifted and debt weighed heavily. He also wrestled with the contradictions of his own life, most notably slavery. Though he recognized its injustice and supported gradual emancipation in theory, he never freed his own slaves. It was a moral tension he did not resolve, one that mirrored the unresolved contradictions of the nation he helped design. Emotionally, Madison lived with the knowledge that his greatest work was now beyond his control. The Constitution would be interpreted, contested, and amended by generations yet unborn. Some outcomes would align with his hopes, others would not. Letting go required humility. Even in retirement, Madison remained committed to education and public service. He supported the founding of the University of Virginia and later served as its rector, believing that an informed citizenry was essential to the survival of Republican government. Ideas, he never forgot, required caretakers. In quiet moments at Montpelier, Madison reflected not on power gained or lost, but on endurance. He had not created a perfect system. He had created a resilient one. When James Madison died in 1836, he left behind no monument of stone. His legacy was less visible, but far more enduring. A framework of governance still standing, still debated, still alive. At home, where his journey had begun, Madison closed his life as he had lived it, thoughtfully, privately, and with the steady hope that reason might outlast ambition. Chapter 13. When Systems Outlast Leaders. James Madison did not live to see the full reach of his ideas, and perhaps that was fitting. The systems he helped design were never meant to glorify their creator. They were meant to endure long after individual names faded from memory. As the decades passed, it became increasingly clear that Madison's greatest achievement was not any single law or office, but a framework capable of surviving change itself. The Constitution was tested almost immediately. Political parties emerged, despite early hopes they would not. Presidents pushed the boundaries of executive power. States resisted federal authority. Yet again and again, disputes returned not to violence, but to institutions, to courts, legislatures, and elections. This, Madison believed, was the quiet victory of design over impulse. At the heart of that design was federalism, a division of power between national and state governments that balanced unity with diversity. Madison understood that a vast republic could not be governed from a single center alone. Local authority preserved community identity, while national authority provided coherence and strength. Neither could dominate without threatening liberty. Equally enduring was his vision of separated powers. By distributing authority across legislative, executive, and judicial branches, Madison sought to ensure that no single ambition could eclipse the rest. This arrangement did not eliminate conflict, it guaranteed it. But conflict, when properly contained, became a safeguard rather than a danger. Emotionally, this philosophy reflected Madison's deep realism about human nature. He did not trust virtue to remain constant. He trusted structure to compensate for its absence. Where others placed faith in leaders, Madison placed faith in systems. As new generations interpreted the Constitution, some drifted far from Madison's intentions. Yet even disagreement testified to the document's strength. A system capable of being argued over, amended, and reinterpreted was one still alive. Fragile governments shatter under pressure. Durable ones bend. In this sense, Madison triumphed over time itself. Presidents came and went. Parties rose and fell. Crises erupted and receded. Through it all, the architecture he helped build continued to shape the boundaries of power. There was no single moment of validation, no final applause. Instead, Madison's success revealed itself slowly, in continuity rather than conquest. His ideas worked not because they were perfect, but because they anticipated imperfection. To understand Madison is to accept a quieter definition of greatness. He did not command armies or dominate history's stage. He designed a system that made domination unnecessary and often impossible. As the Republic moved further into the future, guided by institutions rather than individuals, Madison's presence remained, not as a statue or slogan, but as a living logic woven into the nation's daily governance. In the end, James Madison proved that the most powerful legacy a leader can leave behind is not authority, but restraint. Chapter 14. Legacy in the Balance. History often prefers its heroes visible and towering. It remembers uniforms, victories, and commanding presence. By that measure, George Washington stands unrivaled, the general who secured independence, the first president who gave the Republic its face and dignity. His legacy is immediate, symbolic, and deeply human. In moments of uncertainty, Americans still turn instinctively to his example. James Madison's greatness, by contrast, unfolds more quietly. There is no single image that captures it, no dramatic crossing of rivers, no battlefield triumph. His influence lives in procedures, limits, and invisible lines of authority, felt daily yet rarely noticed. To compare Madison and Washington is not to diminish either, but to understand the different kinds of leadership a republic requires. Washington embodied unity at a moment when unity was fragile. His restraint in power set a precedent that could not be enforced by law alone. It depended on character. Madison, ever the realist, admired this virtue, but did not rely on it. Madison assumed that future leaders might not possess Washington's discipline or self-control. Systems, he believed, must be designed for ordinary humans, not extraordinary ones. Where Washington offered an example, Madison offered insurance. One inspired trust, The other built safeguards. Emotionally, this distinction reflects Madison's deeper view of history. Great men, he knew, do not appear in every generation, but institutions, if properly designed, could protect liberty even in their absence. Madison's Constitution does not ask leaders to be noble. It asks them to be constrained. This difference also shaped how each man is remembered. Washington is celebrated for what he chose not to do, for refusing a crown, for stepping away from power. Madison is remembered for what he constructed, for ensuring that stepping away would not depend on personal virtue alone. In the long arc of time, Madison's influence may be less dramatic, but more constant. Long after Washington's image became fixed in stone, Madison's ideas continued to adapt, restrain, and guide. His legacy is felt whenever power is checked, whenever authority is questioned, whenever disagreement is resolved through process rather than force. As bedtime history, Madison's story whispers where Washington's declares. Yet both are essential. One gave the Republic its moral beginning. The other gave it endurance. In balancing these legacies, we are reminded that a nation does not survive on heroes alone. It survives on structures designed to outlast them. And in that quiet triumph, James Madison's greatness rests.
Chapter 15. A Republic, if we can keep it. Near the end of his life, James Madison was often asked what the Constitution truly meant. He never answered with certainty or triumph. He answered with caution. A republic, he believed, was not a finished achievement, but a continuous responsibility, renewed by each generation, tested by each crisis, and preserved only through vigilance. Madison had watched his creation endure war, faction, and political transformation. He had seen parties form despite early fears, power shift despite careful balance, and ambition press against the limits he had helped design. Yet the system held, not because it prevented conflict, but because it contained it. His most enduring warning was simple and unsettling. Liberty is fragile. The Constitution could channel power, but it could not replace civic virtue. No document, however carefully written, could protect a people unwilling to understand or defend it. Madison believed that ignorance was as dangerous to freedom as tyranny. Even in retirement, he emphasized education as the Republic's lifeblood. An informed citizenry, he argued, was the only reliable guardian of self-government. Without it, elections could become instruments of passion rather than reason, and institutions could be hollowed out from within. Emotionally, Madison lived with both hope and humility. He knew that the Constitution was adaptable, capable of amendment and interpretation. That flexibility was its strength, but it was also a risk. Systems could be bent toward justice or toward abuse. The difference lay not in the parchment, but in the people. Madison did not imagine the future as a straight path of progress. He anticipated moments of regression, tension, and doubt. Yet he believed that a well-designed republic could survive these cycles, provided its citizens accepted responsibility rather than seeking perfection. In this sense, Madison's legacy was not a guarantee, it was an invitation. Each generation, he believed, would face the same question. Would they preserve liberty through reasoned self-restraint, or surrender it to convenience and power? The Constitution offered tools, not answers. It required participation, patience, and trust in process. As bedtime history, Madison's story closes not with certainty, but with quiet resolve. He did not promise that the Republic would always succeed. He promised only that it could endure. if cared for. A republic, if we can keep it. Those words echo not as a warning of failure, but as a call to stewardship. Madison entrusted the future not to heroes, but to citizens. And in doing so, he left behind something rarer than certainty. A system built on faith in human responsibility, even in the face of human imperfection.
Epilogue. The Quiet Architect. When history looks back on the founding of the United States, it often lingers on moments of drama, battles won, declarations signed, leaders standing before cheering crowds. James Madison rarely appears at the center of those scenes. He worked instead in silence, in rooms where decisions were argued rather than celebrated, where the future was shaped by patience more than passion. Madison did not give the nation its voice or its image. He gave it its framework. The Constitution he helped design was never meant to be admired for its beauty. It was meant to function, to restrain power without paralyzing it, to protect liberty without depending on virtue alone. Over time, this quiet architecture proved more durable than any single leader's will. Presidents came and went. Crises tested the system. Yet the structure endured, bending, adapting, and surviving. What makes Madison's legacy so remarkable is not its certainty, but its humility. He understood that institutions are human creations, shaped by flawed minds and incomplete knowledge. That is why he built them to be corrected, challenged, and renewed. Amendments were not signs of failure, but evidence of life. In this way, Madison trusted the future more than the present. He trusted that reasoned debate could outlast anger, that process could absorb conflict, that disagreement, when governed by structure, need not destroy a nation. And yet, Madison never believed the work was finished. Institutions, he knew, are fragile. They survive only if people choose to maintain them. The Constitution does not enforce itself. It depends on citizens willing to understand it, leaders willing to respect it, and generations willing to defend it, even when doing so is inconvenient. As the lights dim on James Madison's story, his presence remains, not as a hero demanding praise, but as a thinker offering guidance. His influence lives in the quiet moments, when power is questioned, when authority is limited, when disagreement finds resolution without violence. If you've enjoyed this slow journey through history, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive and brings more thoughtful histories to those who need them. And we'd love to hear from you. What part of Madison's legacy do you think matters most today? For now, rest with this thought. Nations are not held together by noise or force alone, but by the invisible structures we choose to preserve. James Madison was their quiet architect.